Hello everyone, this is Jason Baker and welcome back to our next hands-on segment, which is focused on S3, the simple storage service. I am logged into the AWS Web Console and I need to go to the S3 dashboard. There's a couple different ways I can do that. Remember last time I went to the services drop down and I searched through the list of services to find that the one I wanted. In this case, I could go to storage and then S3. That's one way to get to that dashboard. Another way is to look in my recently visited list on the left. So as I go to different services in AWS, those services will then appear in my recently visited list. You can see that I recently went to the S3 service, so I could click on the dashboard link there as well. Additionally, I can actually search for services, and sometimes this is really the fastest way to get to a particular service dashboard. So I'll go to the search field and just type in S3, and the very first option that I'm provided is the S3 service dashboard, and so I'll click on that link. And this takes me to the dashboard for S3. Well, as you learned in our class, S3 is a storage service. It's essentially a key value store where we can upload objects in the form of files, and we can store those files within S3 and then update those files, delete them, read the files, of course, download them. So S3 is a massively scalable file storage service. This isn't a file system. Remember, it's not a file system like a file system that lives on your hard drive. This is really a key value store. So in some ways, you could think of it as really being like a database that we use to store files. Now I'm looking at the S3 dashboard, and there are actually quite a few features now that are available within S3. And we're really going to be focused on some of the more basic features. And so on the left-hand side, you see a number of different features that we can look at. We're really just going to be looking at S3 buckets. S3 buckets are those namespaced areas where we can store store files, and we can partition our files into differently named buckets. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new bucket. If I go to this link on the button on the right hand side, create bucket, I'll click on that button, and it's asking me to create a new bucket. I need to provide a bucket name. What should I provide as a name? Well, I could provide most anything I want as long as that bucket name is globally unique. In other words, it has to be a bucket name that nobody else in the entire world is using. And so if you just picked like a more like a common name here for a bucket, chances are you wouldn't be able to create that bucket because somebody is already using it. I'm going to create a bucket, and I'll just say SEIS 615 J Baker 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Chances are this is a unique unique bucket. Nobody else in the world is likely using it. Now, if you were following along in this hands-on segment and you were to try to create a bucket with the same name, then that would be, potentially be a problem because the bucket may already be in use in my account. I'm going to select an AWS region. I don't think I pointed this out when we we first saw the S3 dashboard. The S3 dashboard also is a global type of service, similar to IAM, in that you don't need to pick a particular region. All the buckets that are listed in S3 are buckets that exist across your entire account, across all of the different regions of your account. So this service is a little bit unique from that perspective. I don't want you to be confused, however, because unlike IAM, S3 buckets, S3 resources are definitely regional. If I create a bucket, I have to specify what region that bucket lives in. And in this case, I'll just leave it at the US East 1 region. Anything I store in that bucket is going to be stored in that particular geographic region. And if US East 1, for whatever reason, kind of went away, became unavailable, then I would not be able to access the data stored in a bucket in the US East 1 region. So I selected that region. I can optionally copy settings from an existing bucket if I wanted to. If I wanted to sort of like clone the settings from another bucket, I'm not going to do that here. The next step is to specify whether or not the S3 bucket will be publicly available. And this is extremely important. Maybe the number one reason that companies exfiltrate data or lose data in the cloud is because they inadvertently make that data publicly available. Right, so you've probably read newspaper articles or read blogs on the internet about companies who have their data stolen while hosting that data in the cloud. In almost every case, that's because somebody in the organization, when they created something like an S3 bucket, they inadvertently made that bucket publicly available. And if I make my bucket publicly available, then anybody in the world could potentially download data from that bucket. And you might be asking yourself, well, why would you ever want to do that? And there might be some plausible reasons. For example, you might be hosting your website content on an S3 bucket. And if it's a publicly accessible website, then people need to be able to access those files. That's certainly a valid reason. However, if you are storing if you're working at a healthcare company and you're storing patient medical information in an S3 bucket, then you would absolutely not want to make that information publicly available. By default, when you create an S3 bucket, all public access is blocked, and that's what this checkbox is. And I could uncheck this box, and if I uncheck it, then I'd have to grant public access, using these other options. So I could grant a specific type of public access to the objects in my bucket this way as well. But by default, I'm going to leave this in place. I want to block all public access to my S3 bucket so that I'm the only person, or my organization is the only entity that can access data within the bucket. If I scroll down, I have the option of enabling or disabling bucket versioning. By default, it's disabled. If I enable bucket versioning, then what will happen is the S3 will maintain a version of all the objects that I store within the bucket. So for example, if I upload a file and then later on, like a few days or weeks later, decide to upload a new version of that file, and it's, normally if you were to do that on your local file system, it would overwrite the file. But in this case, instead of overwriting that file, S3 will store the new file as a version. And so the old file actually won't be deleted from the S3 bucket, meaning that over time you will accumulate basically a copy of every file that was ever uploaded to the bucket and every version of every file, meaning that essentially nothing is ever going to be deleted from the bucket. And this can be really important if you are if you're dealing with data that you might have to retain for, let's say, compliance reasons, you might have to maintain that data and store it for multiple years and ensure that none of that data is ever deleted. And you might enable bucket versioning to do that. We can associate tags with our S3 bucket. Remember, tags are essentially metadata that we can associate with an AWS resource, and we can use that metadata to provide us with some additional information about that particular resource, like maybe what team owns that particular resource, or what kind of information we would find in that particular bucket. Encryption. By default, the encryption is disabled on the bucket, but I really think that in almost all cases, we really should enable encryption. So I'll click on the enable encryption link. And what this is doing is it's enabling encryption at rest, which means that when this data is stored on hard drives at AWS in one of their data centers, these data files that we upload into our S3 bucket are going to be encrypted, meaning that not even the engineers at AWS can read our files because they're fully encrypted at rest. So this is an additional layer of protection and security, and oftentimes for highly regulated organizations, they have to enable encryption at rest for their data for compliance reasons. I'm going to leave it at the default encryption type, which is using the AWS S3 key. So that looks good. And so I'm going to go ahead and create the bucket by clicking on the Create Bucket button. And AWS tells me that my bucket has been successfully created. And here's my bucket down here. Remember, I said that this listing is global, so you can see that most of these buckets are in US East 1, but there's at least one bucket that's in US East 2. So all of your buckets across your entire account are going to be displayed here, even though these buckets they're not global resources. These buckets are created within specific regions of AWS. I'll go ahead and click on the bucket that I created. And when I do that, I can see that there are no objects in that bucket yet. It's an empty bucket, right? Because I just created it. I haven't actually uploaded anything to it. And so let me do that. Let's go ahead and upload something to our bucket. And it doesn't really matter what we upload in this case. So I'm going to click on the upload button, and I'm going to add a file. I'm going to browse. I'm just going to pick a random file from my file system, in this case a PDF file. I'm going to upload it into the bucket. Now when I upload this file, optionally I can actually do a couple things. I can modify the access permissions for this file. So for example, my default policy might be that this bucket is private, but I can actually, on a per object basis or per file basis, I can specify that a particular file in that bucket might be readable by the public. So I have that sort of granular level of access controls. I can modify some of the properties of this object. We talked about the different storage classes that are available for S3 objects in AWS. And here on a per object basis, I can specify the storage class. So it defaults to the standard storage class. But if I wanted to, I could change it to like the standard infrequently accessed, or one zone infrequently accessed, or even the reduced redundancy storage level. And if you recall, there are different types of availability and durability associated with these different storage classes, and of course, different pricing levels as well. I'm going to just leave this at the standard storage class. So everything else looks good. Oh, I can also specify a tag, so I can create a tag for that particular object at an object level as well. I'll go ahead and upload this file by clicking on the upload button. You see it gives me a quick little sort of upload bar at the top of the screen. That file has now been uploaded, so I can go ahead and close this. And if I look at my bucket, I'm looking at my bucket object listing, you can see that there is now a file, a PDF file that is stored in the bucket. If I click on that file, then I can see a bunch of different configuration information that's associated with the file. I can make changes to the storage class and so on. These are all updatable, even after the file has been uploaded to the S3 bucket. One of the key things I wanted to point out is that every object that I upload into an S3 bucket gets an object URL. And that's because the objects that we store in S3 are web addressable. Each one of them gets a website address. And if I copy this website address, so I'm just going to click on this little icon on the left, that'll copy it to my web browser. So if I copy that and I paste it into my browser and try to access that file via web browser, I get an error message. I get an access denied error message, which at first might seem a little strange. Because you're thinking to yourself, well, there's a website address that I can use to access this S3 object. How come I can't just put it into my web browser and access that object? Either view it or download it. Well, that's because when I tried to access this object just via my web browser, when I make that request, that website request, I'm not passing in any sort of credentials to the S3 service. So from the perspective of the S3 service, it looks like I'm just any random internet user out there on the web somewhere trying to access this file. And of course, we set up the bucket and we configure the file so that it's not publicly accessible. And so even if I have that web URL for the S3 object, I can't access it publicly. I could access it using my web browser if I modified the web request and passed in a set of credentials. I'm not gonna show you how to do that here. That's something you could certainly do programmatically. You could pass in those credentials as part of the web request header. I'll go ahead and close this and go back to our file. So the point here is that the file has been uploaded to the bucket. It has a web addressable address. It also has an S3 URI. So this is an S3 address that we could use programmatically to access this object as well. I'm going to go ahead and go back to the bucket object listing here. and look at some of the other options that are available when looking at S3 buckets. If I click on the properties link, the properties tab here, I can see the different configuration options for this bucket. Again, bucket versioning is currently disabled. I could enable that. It tells me that encryption is enabled on the bucket, so that file object I uploaded is encrypted at rest. I can modify the bucket permissions here if I want to. I can set up something called a bucket policy, which allows me to really tailor the level of access available to this bucket. So for example, I could restrict access to this S3 bucket from a particular network location. Like I could say, if somebody's on my office network, they could access the files in this S3 bucket, but if they're located somewhere else in the internet, they wouldn't be able to do that. I could do that using a bucket policy. So all kinds of access controls that I can enable for S3 buckets to meet the requirements of my organization. I click on the management link, and here I have access to some really interesting capabilities. For example, I can set up lifecycle rules within the S3 bucket. And lifecycle rules allow you to automate certain tasks, common tasks that might be associated with your data management policies. For example, let's say I want to create a lifecycle rule, and I'm going to create a lifecycle rule name that is going to, let's say it's going to delete files. And I'm going to apply this rule to all of the objects in this bucket. So I want this rule to apply to every object that I locate, that I upload into the bucket. And I have a couple different options. So I want to, in this case, I want to delete previous versions of objects. A number of days after objects become previous versions. So I'm going to say after 30 days, I want to delete any object that's put into this bucket. In this case, maybe I'm using this bucket as a temporary holding place for data, and I don't want the bucket to accumulate a lot of files over time, because I might upload a file into that bucket and then use that file, let's say, to generate a report, or maybe I'm going to transmit that file to a third party. And after 30 days, I really don't need that file anymore. And so I'm going to set up this lifecycle policy to automatically delete those files in the bucket after 30 days. And what that ensures is that the bucket is sort of self-managing, and it will automatically delete files after 30 days, and I don't have to pay for that data. So I'm not going to keep paying for data that's accumulating over time. I'll go ahead and create that rule, and now there's a lifecycle policy that's in place for the entire bucket, and it will delete the files in that bucket after 30 days. So this is a pretty good overview of how you kind of work with S3 buckets, how you create them, how you can upload files into those buckets. If I wanted to delete this file here, I could select a file and then just click on the delete button. I'm not going to delete that for now. If I go back to this dashboard, and if I wanted to delete this bucket that I've created, I could just select the bucket and then click on the delete button. And oh, I got an error message. It says this bucket is not empty. Buckets must be empty before they can be deleted. AWS has this sort of safety mechanism in place for S3 buckets where they won't allow you to delete an S3 bucket that contains files, which is probably a pretty good policy because it means that it'd be hard to inadvertently delete all of your files in a bucket, right? You'd have to like delete all those files first before deleting the bucket itself. So I'll click on the cancel button here. And I could go into this bucket and say, and delete that one file that I uploaded. That would be pretty easy. But let's say that my bucket contained 1,000 files. Or, I mean, I've worked with buckets that have contained literally hundreds of thousands of files. And of course, it would be really, really difficult to have to go to that bucket and then manually delete all of those objects. Well, AWS provides us with a capability that allows us to easily delete all of the objects in a bucket. We can select the bucket and then click on the empty button. And it's asking us, do you want to permanently delete all the objects in the bucket? If so, then you have to type in the words permanently delete. I'm just going to copy and paste those. And when I do that, then I can empty the bucket. And it tells me it's successfully empty that bucket. Of course, it was really fast because there was only one object in there. Now I can, because I have the bucket selected, I can just go up to the delete button, and in order to delete it, I have to type in the name of the bucket. I'll go ahead and copy and paste that again, and I can click on delete bucket, and now that bucket is gone. I hope you enjoyed this hands-on segment working with S3. Again, we only use some of the basic features of S3 in this course, but it's also really helpful to understand some of the more advanced capabilities. So as you may utilize this S3 service in your organization, you have some idea of some of the other use cases that you can solve for using this particular service. Thank you.